The pride of the Imperial
0600
Japanese
hours.
Navy. Four of the
June
finest
4th,
aircraft carriers in the world
1942.
steam relentlessly
Somewhere
forward on
north of the
morning June
international
4th.
date line, in open Pacific water so calm it looks unreal, for aircraft carriers move in tight formation, cutting white lines through a flat blue ocean. Akagi, Kaga, Tsuryu, Hiryu. These are not just ships. They are the single most experienced carrier strike force the world has ever seen. 6 months earlier, planes from these exact decks tore through Pearl Harbor in under 2 hours and crippled the United States Pacific Fleet before it even understood it was at war. On their decks right now, over 250 aircraft. 0 fighters, Val dive bombers, Kate torpedo bombers. Pilots who have never lost a major engagement. Deck crews who can rearm and relaunch a strike wing faster than any navy on Earth. They believe they are approaching a quiet American outpost. They believe the U.S. Pacific Fleet, battered, outnumbered, still recovering from December, has no idea they are coming. They are about to find out how wrong that belief is. 3,000 miles away, in a windowless, poorly ventilated basement beneath the naval base at Pearl Harbor, a small group of exhausted men already know the answer to almost every question the Japanese fleet believes is still secret. They know the target. They know the approximate date. They know, roughly, how many carriers are coming and from which direction they'll strike. They knew all of this before a single Japanese aircraft left its deck. In less than 3 hours from this exact moment, all 4 of those carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Tsuryu, and eventually Hiryu, will be burning wrecks. Japan's naval air power, the force that built its entire early war strategy, will be effectively broken in a single morning. And the reason it happened starts with something almost embarrassingly small, a fake message about a broken water evaporator. This is not a story about who had more ships. Japan did. This is not a story about who had better pilots. By any fair measure, in June of 1942, Japan did. This is a story about who controlled the one thing that actually decided the battle before it started, information. And about how a handful of American codebreakers, working with almost nothing, engineered a trap for an empire that didn't know it had already walked into one. If you've heard of Midway before, you've probably heard it told as a story about dive bombers arriving at exactly the right moment, a miracle, decided in 6 impossibly lucky minutes. That version isn't false. But it's incomplete. It leaves out the part of the story that made the miracle possible in the first place. Because the truth is, the United States Navy shouldn't have been anywhere near Midway with enough force to win. After Pearl Harbor, after the fall of the Philippines, after the fall of Singapore, after months of unbroken Japanese victories across the Pacific, the American fleet was outnumbered, undersupplied, and still rebuilding. By every conventional measure of naval power in the spring of 1942, Japan should have won this battle without much difficulty. It didn't, because for weeks before the first shot was fired, a small, unglamorous team of cryptanalysts in that Pearl Harbor basement had been quietly reading pieces of Japan's naval communications. Not everything. Not even close to everything. But enough fragments, patterns, and repeated code groups to sense that something enormous was coming, and to guess, with real but incomplete confidence, exactly where. The problem was, a guess wasn't good enough. Washington wasn't going to gamble the entire remaining Pacific Fleet on a hunch from a basement team that had been wrong before. They needed proof. Proof the Japanese couldn't fake, couldn't detect, and wouldn't even realize they were providing. So this small team built a trap, not for the Japanese fleet. For the Japanese code itself. What that trap revealed, and what the U.S. Navy did with it in the days that followed, is the real reason 4 of the finest aircraft carriers on Earth ended up at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. And the man at the center of it wasn't a fleet admiral. He was a cryptanalyst most Americans have never heard of. To understand why one intercepted message could matter this much, you first have to understand exactly what Japan believed about itself in the spring of 1942, and why that belief wasn't unreasonable. Since December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy had not lost. Pearl Harbor had gone almost exactly according to plan. Within weeks, Japanese forces had taken Guam, Wake Island, and Hong Kong. By February 1942, Singapore, supposedly Britain's unbreakable fortress in the east, had fallen in one of the most humiliating defeats in British military history. By March, the Dutch East Indies were gone. By April, the Philippines were collapsing, and American and Filipino forces were making their last stand on Bataan and Corregidor. Wherever the Imperial Navy moved, it won, and it won fast, at a cost its planners considered entirely acceptable. This is the psychological backdrop against which Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of Japan's combined fleet, built his plan for Midway. Yamamoto understood something his more optimistic colleagues in Tokyo didn't fully appreciate: America's industrial capacity was enormous, and if the war dragged on, Japan's early advantage would eventually be overwhelmed by sheer production. He had studied in the United States. He knew its factories, its steel output, its population. He believed Japan's only realistic path to a favorable outcome was a quick, decisive knockout blow, something that would force Washington to the negotiating table before American industry fully mobilized. His target, the remaining U.S. Pacific Fleet carriers, which had escaped destruction at Pearl Harbor simply because they happened to be at sea that morning. Yamamoto's plan was to lure those carriers into a trap near Midway Atoll, a tiny, strategically located pair of islands roughly halfway between North America and Asia, destroy them in a decisive battle, and follow up by invading and occupying the atoll itself, extending Japan's defensive perimeter deep into the Central Pacific. There was also a second motive layered underneath the strategic one, and it mattered more to the timing of the operation than most accounts give it credit for. In April of 1942, a squadron of American B-25 bombers, launched from the carrier USS Hornet in a mission known afterward as the Doolittle Raid, struck Tokyo and several other Japanese cities directly. The material damage was minor. The psychological impact inside Japan's naval command was not. For the first time since the war began, the home islands themselves had been touched by American bombs, and it embarrassed a command structure that had promised the Japanese public an impenetrable defensive perimeter. Yamamoto used that embarrassment to push his Midway plan through a skeptical naval general staff that had previously resisted it, arguing that only a decisive destruction of America's remaining carriers could prevent something like the Doolittle Raid from happening again. Urgency, in other words, was baked into the operation from the very beginning, and urgency, as it would turn out, doesn't leave much room for double-checking assumptions. It was an enormous operation. Well over 100 Japanese ships were involved across multiple task forces: the main carrier strike force, a separate invasion fleet, a diversionary force sent north toward the Aleutian Islands to draw American attention away from the real target, submarines positioned to intercept any American ships attempting to respond, and Yamamoto's own battleship force trailing behind, ready to finish off whatever remained of the American fleet once the carriers had done their work. The entire plan rested on one foundational assumption: secrecy. Yamamoto needed the Americans to be surprised, genuinely, completely surprised, the way they had been at Pearl Harbor. If the U.S. Navy knew Midway was the real target instead of a diversion, if they knew the date, if they knew the strength and direction of the attack, the entire elaborate structure of decoys and diversions would collapse, and the ambush would become an ambush of the ambushers. Japanese naval planners believed this secrecy was guaranteed by their code system, a naval cipher known to American cryptanalysts as JN-25. Messages were converted into 5-digit number groups drawn from a code book, then further disguised by adding a second layer of random numbers, a process called super-encipherment. The code book itself was periodically changed. To Japanese naval intelligence, the idea that a demoralized, technologically outmatched American Navy, one still digging bodies out of the mud at Pearl Harbor, could be reading meaningful fragments of this system was not just improbable. It was, to most of the men making decisions in Tokyo, essentially unthinkable. That assumption was already wrong. It had been wrong for months. It just hadn't been tested in a way that mattered yet. In a cramped, poorly lit basement office at the Pearl Harbor Naval Base, a space so unglamorous that some of the men who worked there literally worked in slippers because the constant hum of decrypting machines made regular shoes feel unbearable after 16-hour shifts, a Navy officer named Joseph Rochefort ran a small signals intelligence unit known by its call sign, Station HYPO. Rochefort's team wasn't breaking JN-25 completely. Full decryption of a message that thorough, changed that regularly, was beyond what they could achieve in real time. What they could do was something more limited, and in some ways more remarkable. They could recognize patterns. Recurring code groups. Locations referenced repeatedly. The structure of military orders, even when specific words remained unclear. Over months of relentless, repetitive work, cross-referencing intercepted traffic against previous messages, Rochefort's team had built up a partial map of Japan's naval vocabulary, enough to sense the outline of an operation even without reading every word of it. The work itself was punishing in a way that doesn't translate well to dramatic retellings. It wasn't cinematic code breaking with sudden flashes of insight. It was thousands of hours of tedious cross-referencing, done by a team stretched thin across multiple shifts, using early mechanical tabulating equipment that was primitive even by the standards of the time, supplemented by an enormous amount of manual pattern recognition performed by human analysts staring at columns of 5-digit number groups until repeated fragments started to stand out. Some of Rochefort's analysts had backgrounds in mathematics. Others were simply gifted at the specific, unusual kind of pattern recognition the work demanded, a skill set the Navy had only started to appreciate the value of once the war made it urgently necessary. By mid-May of 1942, that outline had become alarming. Intercepted traffic pointed toward a massive upcoming Japanese operation, bigger than anything since Pearl Harbor, involving multiple carrier groups and a target referred to repeatedly, cryptically, by a 2-letter code group, AF. Rochefort was convinced AF meant Midway Atoll. It fit the pattern of geographic references his team had built up over months of study. But Washington, specifically, the Office of Naval Intelligence and the senior code-breaking authorities on the mainland, wasn't fully convinced. There was another plausible candidate, the Aleutian Islands, off the coast of Alaska, which Japanese forces were also known to be planning to strike as part of the same broader operation. Some analysts in Washington leaned toward the Aleutians as the primary target, with Midway as a secondary concern, or vice versa. The disagreement wasn't trivial. It was existential. Here is the size of the problem Rochefort was facing. The United States Pacific Fleet, in the spring of 1942, had exactly 3 operational aircraft carriers left in the entire Pacific Theater: Enterprise, Hornet, and a badly damaged Yorktown, still limping back from a brutal engagement at the Battle of the Coral Sea. If Nimitz sent those 3 carriers to defend the wrong location, Midway, when the real target was the Aleutians, or the reverse, the United States could lose its entire remaining carrier force in a single, catastrophic miscalculation, leaving the west coast of the continental United States essentially undefended against further Japanese naval action. And it wasn't only Washington's uncertainty that Rochefort was fighting. Within the Navy's own intelligence apparatus, there was open rivalry. A separate code-breaking office in Washington, D.C., known as OP-20G, held its own opinions about Japanese intentions, and those opinions didn't always align with what Rochefort's team in Hawaii believed the intercepts were showing. Some senior officers in Washington leaned toward the theory that the Aleutians were the primary objective, with any reference to AF being a secondary or diversionary target. Rochefort, closer to the raw intercepts and steeped in months of pattern analysis that Washington hadn't fully absorbed, disagreed, and he needed a way to settle the argument definitively, not just win it on the strength of his own conviction. Rochefort needed something more solid than a pattern-matching hunch, however well-informed. He needed proof his enemy couldn't fake, and more importantly, couldn't even realize they were providing. So his team designed something almost absurdly simple, one of the most elegant deception operations of the entire war, built not around ships or aircraft, but around a single, deliberately false radio message. The plan worked like this. Station HYPO arranged for the American garrison stationed on Midway Atoll to transmit a routine-sounding radio message, deliberately sent in the clear, uncoded, exactly the kind of low-priority message that Japanese listening posts would casually intercept and relay up their own chain of command without much scrutiny. The message reported a mechanical problem. Midway's fresh water evaporator, the equipment used to convert seawater into drinking water for the garrison, had broken down. The base was running short on fresh water and requesting resupply. There was no broken evaporator. It never happened. The entire message was constructed for one purpose: to see whether Japanese intelligence would repeat it back through their own communications network in a way that could be intercepted and, crucially, cross-referenced against the mysterious code group AF. The bet was simple but psychologically shrewd. If Japanese forces near or connected to the target designated AF picked up this uncoded American transmission about a water shortage, and then referenced that same water shortage in their own coded reports back to Tokyo, using the code group AF to describe the location experiencing the shortage, that would be undeniable confirmation. Not a pattern. Not a guess. A direct, unambiguous link between the fictional water problem Station HYPO had just invented and the target the Japanese Navy was calling AF. Within days, it worked exactly as hoped. Japanese radio intercept units picked up the fabricated American transmission about the freshwater shortage. And in relaying operational updates back through their own communications channels, messages that Station HYPO was also monitoring, Japanese operators referenced a water shortage at a location designated AF. There it was. Undeniable. Confirmed not by inference, not by pattern recognition alone, but by an enemy operator, somewhere in the Pacific, unknowingly repeating back a lie the Americans had planted specifically to catch them repeating it. AF was Midway. Not the Aleutians. Not a diversion designed to pull American attention away from the real objective. The real target. And once that single fact was locked down with certainty, the flood of previously ambiguous intercepted fragments suddenly snapped into focus. Station HYPO could now begin assembling, with growing confidence, the rough outline of the entire Japanese operation, approximate strength, approximate timing, and, critically, the direction from which the main Japanese carrier strike force would approach. The confirmation didn't just settle an argument between Hawaii and Washington. It transformed the entire nature of the coming battle. Every additional fragment of Japanese traffic that Rochefort's team had previously set aside as too ambiguous to act on could now be reread in light of a confirmed target. References to fueling schedules suddenly indicated departure dates. References to formation groupings suddenly indicated how many carriers were involved and how they would be arranged. What had been a scattered collection of half-understood puzzle pieces became, almost overnight, something close to an operational order, read by the side it wasn't written for. None of this reached Nimitz as a finished picture all at once. Intelligence rarely works that way. It arrived in pieces, over days, each fragment adjusted and re-evaluated as new intercepts came in, with analysts at Station HYPO arguing over interpretation late into the night, aware that a wrong guess here wouldn't just be embarrassing, it would hand Japan an even bigger victory than Pearl Harbor. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, now knew something that Admiral Yamamoto, 3,000 miles away planning what he believed was a devastating surprise, did not. His trap had already been seen. The ambush Yamamoto believed he was setting for an unsuspecting American Navy was, in fact, about to be sprung on a Navy that had been quietly watching him prepare it for weeks. But here's the problem: knowing the plan didn't solve, knowledge alone doesn't win a naval battle. Nimitz now had a location, a rough timeline, and an approximate picture of enemy strength. What he still didn't have was enough ships to be confident of victory. Japan was bringing fleet carriers to Midway, backed by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers in numbers the United States simply couldn't match in the Pacific in June of 1942. Nimitz had Enterprise and Hornet, both healthy, both ready. And he had Yorktown. Yorktown was the problem. Weeks earlier, at the Battle of the Coral Sea, Yorktown had taken a direct bomb hit that tore through multiple decks and started fires deep inside the ship. Japanese intelligence, observing the damage through aerial reconnaissance photographs after the battle, concluded that Yorktown was almost certainly sunk, or at minimum so severely damaged that it would be out of action for months. Naval engineers who inspected the ship when it limped back into Pearl Harbor gave a formal repair estimate, approximately 90 days in dry dock to make Yorktown combat ready again. Nimitz had 3 days. What happened next inside Pearl Harbor's dry docks is, on its own, one of the more remarkable logistical achievements of the entire Pacific War, and it rarely gets the attention it deserves. Nimitz personally toured the ship, inspecting the damage himself, and made a decision that defied the engineer's formal estimate. Yorktown didn't need to be fully repaired. It needed to be made just seaworthy and combat-capable enough to launch and recover aircraft, and to survive long enough to fight. Around the clock, in overlapping shifts, welders, shipfitters, and repair crews swarmed the ship. Sections of damaged hull were patched rather than properly rebuilt. Watertight compartments were sealed rather than fully restored. Non-essential repairs were skipped entirely in favor of anything that affected combat readiness. It was, by any peacetime engineering standard, an unacceptable, corner-cutting rush job. It worked. Within roughly 72 hours, Yorktown steamed back out of Pearl Harbor under its own power, patched together well enough to fight, carrying a partially reconstituted air group pulled together from multiple squadrons to replace losses from Coral Sea. Japanese planners had no idea any of this had happened. As far as Yamamoto's staff understood, Yorktown was gone, or at minimum irrelevant to the coming battle. Their calculations for Midway assumed, at most, 2 operational American carriers. There would be 3. Waiting. Hidden. Positioned exactly where Japanese scout planes weren't expected to look. There is a particular kind of danger in an enemy that thinks it knows the size of the fight it's walking into. Every decision Yamamoto's staff made in the days leading up to Midway, how much fighter cover to allocate, how aggressively to search for American ships, how confidently to proceed with a complex, multi-phase operation involving diversions and delayed strikes, was built on a carrier count that was already wrong. Not wrong by a little. Wrong by 50%. And it was wrong specifically because of a repair job that violated every peacetime engineering timeline on record, ordered by a commander who understood that in wartime, good enough to fight and fully repaired are 2 very different standards, and that the side willing to accept the first often gets to dictate the terms of the battle to the side still waiting for the second. On the morning of June 4, 1942, the operation Yamamoto had spent months designing began exactly as planned, which is precisely the problem, because as planned assumed an enemy that didn't already know the plan. Japanese scout planes launched at dawn, sweeping outward from the carrier force in search patterns designed to detect any American ships in the area before the main strike against Midway's airfield went in. One of those scout planes, launched from the cruiser Tone, was delayed by mechanical problems, a small, almost trivial malfunction that would end up mattering enormously. The scouting sweep, when it finally happened, reported nothing unusual. No American carriers detected. Exactly what Japanese commanders expected to hear, because their entire operational assumption was built on the belief that the U.S. Navy had no idea Midway was the target and therefore had no reason to have carriers anywhere near this particular stretch of ocean. American carriers were there. Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily patched Yorktown were positioned northeast of Midway, engines idling, hidden by distance and by the simple fact that Japanese search patterns hadn't been designed to look in exactly the right direction, because nothing in Japanese intelligence suggested they needed to. The first phase of the Japanese attack proceeded on schedule. Aircraft launched from the 4 carriers struck Midway's airfield directly, inflicting real damage on installations and defenses, but not enough to fully neutralize the island as a threat. The strike force commander leading that first wave radioed back a request: a second strike against Midway would be needed to finish the job. This request landed on Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo at almost exactly the wrong moment and forced him into the decision that would define the entire battle. Nagumo's aircraft not committed to the first strike against Midway were, per standard doctrine, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, held in reserve specifically in case American ships, particularly carriers, were detected. If he ordered a second strike against Midway's airfield instead, those reserve aircraft would need to be rearmed with land attack bombs, a slow process that would leave the ship-killing ordnance sitting exposed on hangar decks during the changeover. Believing, based on the scouting reports available to him, that no American carriers were in the area, Nagumo made the decision that seemed logical given the information he had: rearm the reserve aircraft for a second strike against the island. Deck crews began the laborious process of swapping torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for land attack ordnance, bombs and munitions now stacked in hangar bays and on decks, waiting to be loaded, in a ship that was, at that exact moment, more vulnerable than at almost any other point in the entire operation. Then, roughly 20 minutes into this rearming process, a delayed report finally arrived from that mechanically troubled scout plane from Tone. American ships had been spotted. And soon after, a follow-up report added the detail that changed everything: what appeared to be an American aircraft carrier was among them. Nagumo now had to reverse course entirely, order the rearming process stopped, and begin switching munitions back to torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs suitable for attacking ships instead of land targets. All of this, mid-changeover, under time pressure, on decks that were, for a critical window, cluttered with exposed ordnance that should never have been there in the first place. It's worth pausing here on exactly how dangerous this configuration was, because it's the detail that later, in some post-war accounts, would get exaggerated into legend: decks supposedly stacked wall-to-wall with bombs and fuel hoses, an image that some historians have since pushed back on as more dramatic than the physical evidence supports. What can be said with confidence is this: the rearming process, whatever its exact scale on each individual ship, meant that live ordnance was being moved, stored, and handled in hangar bays and on decks at a moment when those same decks needed to be clear and ready to launch a defensive strike. Even a partial version of that vulnerability, multiplied across for carriers simultaneously, was enough to turn an ordinary bomb hit into something far more catastrophic than it would have been under normal conditions. Nagumo also had another decision to make in these same critical minutes: whether to launch his reserve aircraft immediately, armed as they currently were, accepting a disorganized and under-escorted strike against an enemy of unknown strength, or hold them back long enough to properly rearm and organize a coordinated attack. He chose to wait for a coordinated strike. It was, by conventional naval doctrine, the more disciplined choice. It also meant his most dangerous window of vulnerability would last several minutes longer than it otherwise might have. This is the exact moment that most popular retellings of Midway treat as pure, uncomplicated luck, the miracle framing, the idea that Japan simply got unlucky with timing. It wasn't luck. Or rather, it wasn't only luck. It was the collision of two separate decisions made weeks and even months apart, on opposite sides of the ocean, one made in a windowless code-breaking basement under Pearl Harbor, the other made on a carrier flight deck in the heat of a rapidly evolving tactical situation, finally intersecting at the same coordinates, at almost the exact same hour. Because while Nagumo scrambled to reverse his rearming order, American torpedo squadrons launched from Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown were already inbound, converging on the Japanese fleet from multiple directions, largely uncoordinated due to the chaos of a battle unfolding faster than anyone could fully control. The first of these squadrons to arrive, Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet, flew directly into the heart of the Japanese fleet's fighter cover, slow, low, unescorted by any fighter protection of their own, carrying torpedoes that, if history is honest about it, weren't even particularly reliable. Japanese Zero fighters, some of the most capable carrier-based fighters in the world at that point in the war, dropped down to meet them. What followed wasn't a battle in any meaningful sense. It was a massacre. Torpedo Squadron 8 was annihilated, every single aircraft shot down, every torpedo missing its target, every crew member killed except one, an ensign named George Gay, who survived by hiding beneath a seat cushion in the water and watched the rest of the battle unfold from the ocean's surface below. Their sacrifice wasn't the plan. No one designed it this way. It was, from a purely tactical standpoint, close to a total failure. And it is, without question, one of the most important accidents in the history of naval warfare, because it did something the American commanders hadn't fully anticipated. It pulled every available Japanese fighter down to sea level, chasing torpedo bombers, clearing the sky above the fleet almost completely of defenders at exactly the moment a different kind of American aircraft was arriving from a very different altitude. High above the fleet, arriving almost by chance rather than coordinated plan, dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown converged on the Japanese carriers from an altitude the Zero fighters, busy fighting off Torpedo Squadron 8 down near the waves, were no longer positioned to defend against. What happened in the next several minutes didn't just decide the outcome of a single battle. It decided the balance of naval air power in the Pacific for the remainder of the war. Dive bombers from Enterprise struck Kaga and Akagi almost simultaneously. Nearly at the same moment, dive bombers from Yorktown struck Sarayu. All three attacks landed within a span of roughly 6 minutes, hitting carriers whose decks were still cluttered with the exposed bombs, torpedoes, and fuel lines from Nagumo's interrupted rearming process, the single most vulnerable condition a carrier can be caught in. Bombs that might have caused serious but survivable damage under normal circumstances instead triggered catastrophic secondary explosions, as fires spread rapidly through decks packed with fuel and munitions that should have been safely stowed but weren't. Within minutes, all three carriers were burning uncontrollably, their flight decks destroyed, their crews fighting fires that, in most cases, could not be contained. A fourth Japanese carrier, Hiryu, escaped this initial wave of attacks and launched counterstrikes that severely damaged Yorktown, the same patched-together ship that Japanese intelligence had believed was already sunk, now taking hits that would eventually force its crew to abandon ship. There is a bitter irony worth sitting with here. The very ship whose damage had convinced Japanese intelligence it could safely discount an entire American carrier from its planning was now, in its second life, absorbing exactly the kind of punishment that would have sunk a less hastily patched vessel outright, and still managing to survive long enough that its air group had already helped cripple 3 of Japan's carriers before Hiryu's aircraft ever found it. By late afternoon of the same day, American dive bombers, launched in a hurried follow-up strike once Hiryu's location was finally confirmed, located and struck the fourth carrier as well, leaving it burning and beyond saving. Within hours, its crew would follow the same grim ritual already carried out 3 times that day aboard Akagi, Kaga, and Sarayu, fighting fires until the order came to abandon ship, then watching from nearby destroyers as one more piece of the Imperial Navy's carrier force slipped beneath the surface of the Pacific. The dive bomber squadron commanders who led those attacks, men like Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey from Enterprise, had themselves been running on fumes and guesswork in the final minutes before the strike. McCluskey's own group had been searching an empty patch of ocean, running low on fuel, on the verge of turning back without ever finding the Japanese fleet, when a fortunate sighting of a lone Japanese destroyer racing to rejoin the main force gave them a heading to follow. It was, in its own smaller way, another piece of the same pattern running through the entire battle, American forces arriving at the decisive moment not purely through flawless planning, but through a combination of prior intelligence, hurried improvisation, and a willingness to take a chance that a less prepared, less informed command might not have taken with the same confidence. By the close of June 4, 1942, a single day, Japan had lost all 4 of the fleet carriers it had brought to Midway. Along with them went hundreds of aircraft, and something arguably even harder to replace, hundreds of Japan's most experienced naval aviators, men who had trained for years and fought since Pearl Harbor, whose combined skill represented an institutional knowledge base that Japan's wartime training programs, rushed and compressed under the pressure of an ongoing war, would never be able to fully reconstitute. Yamamoto's trap, the elaborate operation built around diversions, decoys, and the assumption of total secrecy, had failed before it was ever truly sprung. Not because Japanese pilots flew poorly. Not because Japanese equipment was inferior. It wasn't. Zero fighters were, aircraft for aircraft, extremely capable. Japanese carrier crews were, by any objective measure, among the most experienced in the world. It failed because the enemy Yamamoto believed was blind had, in fact, been reading fragments of his mail for weeks. Trace the chain backward and every link connects. The fake water shortage message, designed to catch an unsuspecting Japanese communications operator repeating back a lie. The confirmation that AF meant Midway, and not the Aleutians. The decision to send a barely patched-together Yorktown into battle instead of leaving it in dry dock for the 90 days engineers said it needed. Japanese scout planes searching in the wrong pattern, at the wrong time, because nothing in their intelligence suggested they needed to look elsewhere. Nagumo's forced, mid-battle reversal of his rearming order, catching his carriers in their single most vulnerable configuration. Torpedo Squadron 8's costly, almost accidental diversion of Japanese fighter cover down to sea level, clearing the sky for the dive bombers that actually delivered the decisive blows. None of these were isolated strokes of fortune, arriving independently and coincidentally at the same battle. They were links in a single causal chain, one that started weeks earlier in a cramped, poorly ventilated basement under Pearl Harbor, with a message about water that was never true. Midway didn't just cost Japan for aircraft carriers, though that loss alone was staggering. It cost Japan the strategic initiative it had held, uncontested, since the first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor. From this point forward, the Imperial Japanese Navy would fight a defensive war, stretched across an ocean it no longer controlled, its remaining carrier force too depleted to mount another operation on the scale of what had just failed. The United States, meanwhile, its industrial base entirely untouched by the fighting, its shipyards only beginning to ramp up wartime carrier production, would not lose the strategic advantage in the Pacific again for the remainder of the war. The imbalance this created would only widen with time. American shipyards, over the following 2 years, would launch new fleet carriers at a pace Japan's industrial base could never realistically match, ships built by a nation whose factories had never been touched by enemy bombs, whose steel production and skilled labor force remained fully intact throughout the war. Japan, by contrast, could build replacement hulls, slowly and at real cost, but it could not replace what had actually been lost at Midway with anything close to the same speed, the veteran aircrews who had trained for years before the war even began, whose accumulated combat experience simply could not be taught in a classroom or compressed into a shortened wartime course. Later battles across the Pacific, the grinding campaign for Guadalcanal that began just 2 months after Midway, and the string of island battles that followed over the next 3 years, would be fought increasingly by Japanese pilots with a fraction of the training and experience their predecessors had carried into June of 1942. The men who died at Midway believing they had simply been caught in an accident of timing, the crews of Torpedo Squadron 8, the sailors aboard a Yorktown that everyone believed should still have been in dry dock, the pilots who launched that morning and never returned, had, without knowing it, been part of a plan set in motion weeks before any of them ever took off. Not a plan to win a fair fight through superior numbers or superior firepower, because on paper, the United States Navy had neither of those advantages at Midway. A plan to make sure, quietly and invisibly, that the fight was never fair to begin with, just not in the direction Japan expected. Japan lost the Battle of Midway on the morning of June 4, 1942, in roughly 6 minutes of dive bomber attacks that no one on either side could have precisely predicted or controlled. But the war for the Pacific had already tipped weeks earlier, in a windowless basement, over a message about a water shortage that never actually happened. Somewhere in the wreckage of that morning, for carriers that had once seemed unstoppable settled onto the floor of the Pacific, taking with them a generation of Japan's finest naval aviators. And somewhere in that same basement, the team that made it possible went back to work the next morning, on the next intercept, the next fragment, the next fake message, because for them, there was no dramatic ending. Just another shift, in another set of slippers, chasing the next thing an enemy didn't yet know it had already given away.